going on. But then the 19th century rolled around and bam, we had total war. As a result, entire countries, not just armies, were legitimate targets. World War II was a total war, so navies thought nothing of attacking ships carrying food even if the food was destined for civilians. The goal was to starve the enemy. Disrupting public life and damaging the country as much as possible. 5 Food inventions that changed the way we eat breakfast. This kind of warfare quickly led to food shortages. To alleviate the problem, the UK and US governments rationed the amount of food each person could buy. Naturally, some foods disappeared from the dinner table for years, since many luxury ingredients were either impossible or hard to find. People resorted to some frankly weird substitutes which we'd barely consider eating today. Here are 10 of the best. Bon appetit. 1. Eggless mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is the most popular condiment in the US, appearing on tables more than any other sauce including tomato ketchup. It is the savior of bland cheese sandwiches and green salads as well as the base for lots more exciting sauces, like tartar sauce. In the 1940s, mayonnaise was just as popular as it is today. So, when people ran out of eggs, it's no wonder that they simply made mayonnaise without. But what could replicate the strong flavor and silky texture that makes us love mayo so much? Well, potato was the best they had. And while it certainly didn't taste the same, it could still make a smooth sauce with a couple of additions. Oil and fat were needed. Some people used vegetable oil if they could get it, but national margarine, the replacement for butter, was their only option a lot of the time. 6. Once they had the smooth potato, some strong flavors like vinegar and mustard could turn a bland sauce into something that would work as long as they didn't expect it to taste like mayonnaise. 2. Dripping. During the war, Europe and America suffered a fat shortage. This might sound like a good thing, but it was a huge problem when people were already struggling to get enough fat and calories. Most of the world's cooking fats were made in East Asia and Africa, which were inaccessible when German U-boats dominated the seas. The government also needed oil to make gunpowder for weapons. So a lot of cheap fat didn't make it to the public. Everyone was so desperate that the British government had to urge people not to cook with paraffin. The usual butter on the shelves was replaced by national margarine, which most people didn't like. Fat and oil were essential in many recipes, though. So the public started saving fat wherever they could. Any fat released from a joint of meat during cooking was usually kept in a jar. This was called dripping, and it was the primary cooking fat for several years. 5. American sausage. Meat took a while to catch on in wartime Britain. But people quickly noticed that the tins came with a thick layer of fat in them. Far from being put off, they treasured this fat and stored it for use in other recipes. Tinned meat became very popular as a result. 3. National loaf. In Britain, most bread at the time was made with Canadian wheat, which had to be shipped across the Atlantic. This wheat took up cargo space that could have been used for more important things, like munitions. In 1942, the British government banned white bread outright. In its place, they introduced a new kind of bread called the national loaf. It was made mostly using wheat grown in Britain. The British wheat was less refined, which helped it go further. Parts of the plant that were usually taken out, like the bran, were left in, giving the bread a rough texture. The national loaf was so bad that the British public called it Hitler's secret weapon. The government put out propaganda to get people to like it. A rumor that the bread increased people's sex drives was almost certainly spread on purpose, on top of being smaller than the pre-war loaves. The national loaf was gray in color and had a texture like sawdust. The crust was tough, and the bread itself was hardly ever fresh. Despite this, it was much healthier than the white stuff. In fact, when the government finally reintroduced white bread 8 years later, some people protested that the national loaf should be kept for health reasons. Fanta is one of the world's most popular sodas, beloved for its orange flavor and its colorful, happy style. This version was made by Coca-Cola in Italy in 1955, and it quickly became popular across Europe. But the original Fanta was made in 1940, and its story is a little darker. Coca-Cola exploded in Germany during the 1930s, going from sales of 100,000 cases a year to just over 4 million by the end of the decade. The company's German branch was becoming one of its greatest success stories. But that would change with the outbreak of war. The Allies embargoed Germany, and shipments of the essential Coca-Cola syrup from America dried up, with supplies eventually running out. By this time, Coca-Cola Germany had been cut off from the main company in the US, and it needed to sustain itself. In a last-ditch effort, they launched a new drink made of whey, apple fiber, and beet sugar. Not exactly as appetizing as Coca-Cola, but in a desperate wartime Germany, it was good enough. The new drink was named Fanta, short for fantasy. The German word for imagination. The drink sold extremely well, with 3 million cases shipped in 1943. Most Germans used it for cooking because sugar was heavily rationed. It was discontinued when the war ended, which tells us just how bad it probably tasted. 5 National Cheddar. France is home to thousands of varieties of cheese, including some international favorites like Camembert and Brie. This makes France the undisputed cheese champion of the world. However, this overshadows the equally important British cheese tradition, which gave us classics like Cheshire, Gloucester, and Cheddar. Once upon a time, British cheeses could easily have competed with French ones. But the English cheese industry collapsed in the 20th century, and its reputation went with it. What happened? Rationing. After the war started, the British government wanted to make sure that everyone could get his fair share of cheese. So they decided that only one type of cheese would be made, government cheddar. Most of the country's cheese factories were converted to make this wartime cheese. Unlike many food substitutes, this was apparently a decent replacement. Government cheese was made for years after the war, too. By the time it was discontinued, much of Britain's traditional cheese-making industry had been wiped out. Before World War I, around 3,500 independent cheese makers existed in the UK. By 1945, there were fewer than 100. Some classics like Wensleydale nearly went extinct. And while the British cheese industry has made a remarkable comeback since the 1990s, it's still not as varied as it once was.